Democrats in Congress, both political parties that together compromise the ruling elite in Washington, Barack Obama, or finally the clueless voters who put these folks in charge and have allowed all this to happen. Well, that is, let me count these. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 different possible answers. Now, in regard to the intellectual circumstances of most people, probably the only, or one of the few honest answers here were, I don't know. Out of 2,835 votes, 1 was given to this prospective answer, I don't know. Now, of course, that answer reflects two things. It does reflect the truth because most people don't understand what the root cause of our problems are. And as we've explained so many times, the root problem isn't just monetary in this obfuscation of our currency. On the contrary, it is a huge political problem across the world because the largest contributors to candidate after candidate after candidate are the purported financial system, in other words, the central banks of the world, which therefore install people into power to in fact deny us representation, which is the only way that this breach of power can persist. After all, as our Freedom of Information Act inquiry to the Bank of England itself demonstrates, the banking system believes that it's not accountable to the people. There is no justification of this obfuscation of the currency. The Bank of England itself, Secretary Ben Norman of the Bank of England himself, denies us an answer to a question that every banking system of the world would have a ready answer for if that banking system ever were in history justified to the people. And that is, does the Bank of England give up lawful consideration in the debts it presumes from the people in obfuscating their promissory obligations into falsified debts to the Bank of England? So, obviously, as we would be the recipients of that thing of lawful value, instead of evidence of our promissory obligations, we would receive our very own promissory obligations, which we persist in believing in our utterly disgraceful ignorance of these issues, that we believe we have to borrow our own promissory obligations into circulation, merely because the banks render them in some further universal form, which of course we would rightly do under representative government, because there's no reason for the people to subject their own promissory obligations to exploitation, particularly when the means and form of that exploitation are terminal. You see? So this is the reason the world is erupting. And what's happening in Egypt and Libya? They've already got central banks. They rushed over there to Muslim countries in which interest is forbidden, strictly forbidden. in Islam, both the giving and the taking of riba, as it's called, are forbidden, strictly forbidden. And so Egypt rising up against unemployment and Libya rising up against unemployment, sure, it's against abuse of power too. But why does the abuse of power exist? Because the leadership of these countries has exploited the people. And so what do we get as a result of these uprisings? We get a vehicle for further exploitation of the people. The news media, for instance, during the Libyan uprising, has voiced the carrot, if you will, of that to get rid of Gaddafi would pave the way for investment in Libya. Investment isn't what Libya needs. Investment is exploitation. And the only way that you get exploitation is if you deny the people their right to issue promissory obligations to fund their necessary means of prosperity. Instead, you have a foreign entity which will issue evidence of the people of Libya's promissory obligations and multiply the costs upon them by interest, or what is effectively interest, or the taking of more, because that will require a reflation of the circulation through the central banking system that's been imposed upon Libya. And so we have, indeed, the very same escalation of exploitation given now to foreign entities. It matters not who the entities really are, it matters that the exploitation exists, and particularly it matters that it exists by an obfuscation of the currency. So we have this in Libya, we have it in Egypt, we have it around the world, and we have it particularly in England, where today, owing to decades and decades of hopelessness to huge sectors of the population, you have an inevitable boiling up of this conflict of the people against denial of representation. So our next question's answer in this poll, who is responsible for America's current financial crisis, which equates, of course, to who is responsible to the global financial crisis, in truth. The next answer was no one in particular, it's just the natural cycle of economics. Well, 2 votes were given for this answer. Now, no one in particular, it's just the natural cycle of economics. Who would think, rightly, that amidst facts which include a fact that natural resources have not been exhausted, the people remain as willing and capable as before to persist in production which would produce prosperity, and yet the means of production are denied the people by this obfuscation of the currency. The means and opportunity for production are denied the people by this obfuscation of the currency, unnaturally. So this can't be a natural cycle of true economics, which of course economy is an eradication of all redundant cost and inefficiency. This can't be a natural cycle of economics, so you can't answer this question truly if you understand what true economics is. So nonetheless, as economics, as the lie of economics is practiced, We could answer it truly that this would be, of course, the inevitable consequence of the lie of economics, but it's not natural in any way. Nonetheless, 2 people out of 2,835 votes voted for this answer to the question. Now, the next one in the order that I mentioned them was George W. Bush. Of course, Democrats have blamed the state of affairs as an inherited state of affairs from the prior president's misdoings. Now, in truth, of course, you do inherit the state of affairs from the prior president or their administration or the government in whole. However, all of that may be responsible for the inherited state of affairs. But as I explained to the Reagan campaign in 1979, Reagan was advocating that, he was going to solve our issues by reducing federal tax rates 10% per year for 3 years, 30% after 3 years in federal tax rates, and he was claiming this would balance the federal budget and eradicate price inflation. I offered to prove and was taken up on my offer to submit my proofs that it was impossible for Reagan's proposition to succeed in its declared object. Of course, at the time, Reagan didn't tell us that he was going to provide most of this reduction in taxes to the rich. But what was wrong with these propositions is that they couldn't solve our problem, much like Obama ran promising change you can believe in, but not even declaring what that change was. Reagan also appealed for change, said we needed change. And while Reagan at least declared what the change was going to be, this 10% per year reduction in federal tax rates for 3 years, while he did declare this, he nonetheless never proved that it was a means to accomplish the intended or declared object. And so the material that I provided the Reagan early campaign in 1979, as soon as I heard on the radio that he'd declared his presidency or candidacy, and this was his advocated program. When I heard the advocated program, I called Reagan campaign headquarters immediately and was engaged by courteous and responsible people, and my material was requested. And it immediately engendered a rift, evidently, in the Reagan personnel who were engaged in the campaign. In other words, the credibility of my work registered with some people. And basically, what I had advocated I could do was to prove these things as follows. That is, I proved that, again, I just reiterated my basic proofs of inevitable failure under this obfuscation of the currency, in which an implicit obligation to perpetually reflate the circulation of what interest and principal were paying out of circulation inherently required borrowing principal as new debt equal to a former sum of debt, therefore making it mathematically impossible to pay down any prior sum of debt, of course, or resolving individual debts, but only by sustaining industry, which requires perpetually borrowing interest and principal back into circulation. So what interest we're paying out of circulation, as we've explained many times, is borrowed back as new debt above any former sum